Dave here with another Limitless Brave short. Today we're going to be talking about fear, conquering fear, and how a lot of fears are just made up projections in our own mind. See, we're born with two primary fears, the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. And those fears are there as a protection mechanism to us as human beings. My fear was actually the fear of falling. However, I never really knew that until I jumped out of an airplane. So I'm going to share how I conquered my own fear through skydiving. We have to go back many decades to around 17 or 18 years of age when I had taken some of my first flights, and I had flown out to Jackson Hole to go do some skiing. It was my first trip out west. I lived on the East Coast at the time, and it was an interesting experience. But I started flying more after that initial trip, and I developed this ridiculous fear of flying, so much that I actually stopped flying for 10 years. I drove everywhere. I wouldn't even get on a plane because that's how much I made this fear a real thing in my own mind, when I literally had no reason to create the fear. Sure, we had flown through some storms and some turbulence. It was nothing, honestly, really bad at all. But in my mind tracked it as something different. My mind tracked it as something that was a major threat to me. And it was triggering that primal fear of falling, but I didn't even know about that at the time. So my world started shrinking. I started declining trips to Europe. I started declining trips out west with friends. And if I would book a flight somewhere to try to conquer the fear, I'd just cancel the ticket and I wouldn't go on the trip anyway. So I had a grand vision of the world and what I wanted to do in the world, as well as where I wanted to travel and who I wanted to hang out with and the things that I wanted to experience. It was a grand plan. But I had this grand plan, but I also had a crippling fear. And so I had these two opposing ideas in my mind of this free, big world that I needed to explore and the terror of actually getting on an airplane. Silly, I know, but that's where I was at the time. And again, I created this fear in my mind that was completely irrational. There was no reason whatsoever for me to actually be afraid of flying. Statistically, we know that flying is much safer than driving. Even driving to the drop zone to skydive is more dangerous, statistically speaking, than actually making skydives all day long. So how did I conquer this fear? Well, I really hadn't set out to try to conquer it. It just kind of happened. At the time, I had a clothing company that was catering to the action sports world, and we had gone to a base jumping event, which I thought base jumping was the coolest thing in the world. And I started meeting base jumpers and talking with them, asking, hey, how do you get into this sport? And they said, well, you got to start skydiving first. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was like, I don't fly. I hate flying. I'm afraid of flying. I'm not going to skydive. And they're like, well, that's the path. That's what you got to do, especially if you want to be safe and not kill yourself. It's really important to get a lot of skydives before you start base jumping. And then I kind of befriended them, and we talked more and more about skydiving, and they slowly coaxed me into the world of skydiving. And as I learned more about the sport and the people in the sport, a lot of people that skydive are afraid of flying, afraid of heights. So I found this really fascinating, and I was like, well, if people who also have a fear of flying can jump out of a plane, or people who are afraid to climb up an 8-foot ladder can't climb up a ladder, and they're jumping out of planes and doing it repetitively, there's got to be something there for me. As far as heights go, I had already been rock climbing. being on top of tall buildings, being exposed off big, steep rock faces, it was no big deal. I didn't mind it. It was something about the plane, something about being in the plane. Part of it was like, I didn't know how aviation worked. I didn't really know how planes worked. So I felt, in a sense, out of control, on top of creating this fear in my mind. So I was talking with one skydiver, super cool guy. I said, why did you start jumping? And he said, well, I was just interested in it. But I tell you, the big thing for me was it changed my whole perspective on the world. I was like, wow, that's a bold statement, that a sport can change your whole perspective on the world. And at the time, I thought that was interesting, but I didn't realize how true it actually was, because still at this point, I hadn't made a skydive. So as I befriended and came closer to the people that I met at the base jumping event who were avid skydivers, they kept inviting me to come make a skydive, and I did. And I just remember riding up in the plane, totally afraid, and thinking I was gonna pass out. I don't know what I was thinking. It was just unbelievably overwhelming for me to be in that plane, knowing that I was gonna jump out of it. But there was this small part of me driving me forward saying, you have to face this fear. You have to do this because you wanna grow and you want to see the world in a different light based on what this other guy was saying. So it wasn't even so much at that point about making the jumps for me. It was about changing my perspective on the world. So as we get to altitude and the door opens and the green light goes on and everybody starts jumping out and you hear that suction of a human being getting pulled out of a plane when they jump is something, like when you hear that, that's something you'll never forget from skydiving because it's such an interesting sound. You literally hear the vacuum of people being quote unquote pulled out of the plane even though they're not being pulled out of the plane. It just sounds like they are. And so that sound is ingrained in my mind. And it's a very interesting sound. So that was the first experience, even before I got out of the plane, that I was like, wow, this is intense. And my instructor, who was a good friend of mine at the time, because I'd been hanging out with these guys for a while, we ran through the procedures before we jumped. Of course, he tricked me. He's like, we're gonna leave the door on 3. And of course, we're out the door at 2. And the main instruction as we left the plane was just watch the plane as we're in free fall as best you can. So I did that. And within the first 2 to 3 seconds that I was now in free fall from the plane, watching it fly away, I had realized that my fear of flying was actually a fear of falling out of a plane or crashing, so to speak, in a plane. I didn't know what the sensation of falling through the sky felt like, and that ultimately had scared me for some reason. And that's why I created this fear, this irrational fear about flying. And as we're going through free fall, and I'm watching the earth slowly get closer and the canopy opens and I feel all the G-forces, and then we're turning and flying the canopy through the sky, feeling even more G-forces, and we come into land. I knew what this guy that I was talking with meant when he said, it'll change your perspective on the world. I literally got to see and experience the world in a completely different way that less than 1% of the world has ever experienced. And that is in free fall. Falling to earth is just an undescribable, incredible, amazing experience. And by the time I got on the ground, I said, let's do it again. I was hooked. And the reason that I was hooked is because I now knew what the fear was that was holding me back in life, holding my life back from exploding into what it could be. And so with that realization, not only did I have a new perspective on the world, I had also found a new, very addictive sport to participate in. So at this point, I still had never traveled outside of the US. I had traveled all over the US, but never outside the US. And This was several years into my skydiving career at this point, where I had jumped all over the East Coast and out on the West Coast, and really racked up some jumps. And I had met a gentleman from Australia who had this adventure travel company, and he wanted me to come do some skydiving stunts for him to film for his travel company. So I went to Australia. It was my first trip out of the country to skydive, to do some stunt work and get paid to do it. And I was like, wow, this is a dream. This is something that only a very few amount of people get to do. And I was now one of those people. That big kind of fantasy dream that we all have started to become a very true thing for me and a very real thing for me that I was now actually experiencing. It wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was real life. And after that trip, that opened up the whole world to me. I've skydived all over this planet with some amazing people, including the royal family in Jordan. I got to spend several days in the country of Jordan skydiving over the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth. We had a wonderful time. It was one of the greatest memories of my life so far. It was just a beautiful experience. And I really couldn't believe that this was now my life. Again, confirming what that guy I had originally talked to said, it's going to change your whole perspective on the world. So it truly has. I've got to skydive in some of the most amazing and interesting places on the planet, to see the world from a very different perspective than just sitting on land or being in a boat, but actually flying my body and guiding it through time and space on the way back to Earth. And so I want to say to you that if you have a fear that is crippling to you, if you have a fear that is holding you back from your larger purpose in life or the bigger, better version of yourself, I encourage you to face it head on, even if it's crippling, even if you can barely make it through. Because as we get to what's called the terror barrier, when it comes to concepts of fear and ideas that we may think are not for us, as we get to that terror barrier, we really have to dig deep and push through that barrier so that we can become a bigger, better version of ourselves and learn that the fear that we're projecting onto ourselves about things most of the time is not true and is not going to hurt us. So I'd encourage you to find some people to mentor you, to help you through whatever fear is holding you back, and get yourself living a bigger, better life. Because while it may seem that this thing in your life is insurmountable, I promise you it's not. So whatever vision you have for yourself, you can achieve it. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to walk head on into the fear. It takes extreme commitment when everything in your body and your mind is screaming, don't do this, to do it and go through it and come out on the other side a changed person. That's what life is about. It's about continually facing our fears, challenging ourselves to keep leveling up so that we become a bigger, better, bolder, more authentic version of ourselves. So that's my story of how I conquered one of my deepest fears and how I created it in my mind and how silly it was and how it was just this projection that actually was not serving me in any way, shape, or form. It was actually walking through that fear, facing it head on, and coming out on the other side unscathed, and seeing that when you do face fears, your whole world shifts and becomes bigger than you could ever imagine. Thanks for watching the podcast. I'll catch you in the next one.